April 30th, 1975, a date etched forever in history. As Liberation Army tanks roared into Saigon, the victory flag soared above the Independence Palace, the world bore witness to a staggering moment, the mightiest superpower on earth brought to its knees by a small but unbreakable nation. This wasn't just Vietnam's glorious triumph, it was America's most humiliating, disgraceful defeat, a stain they could never erase. But this story didn't begin in 1975. Rewind to the 1940s, when colonial France faltered in its fight to reclaim Indochina. The United States, with dreams of dominating the region, quietly stepped into the game. At first, they used the French as pawns to suppress Vietnam's revolutionary spirit. But when France fell, Washington took matters into its own hands. South Vietnam became their chosen outpost, a bulwark against the rising tide of communism. On August 17, 1954, mere weeks after the Geneva Conference, President Eisenhower ordered direct aid to pro-Western regimes in Indochina. By September 8, the U.S. formed SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, placing Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under its protective shield. No Dien Diem, America's hand-picked ally, was showered with money and weapons to build an anti-communist government. They believed this would be an iron wall to stop the Viet Minh in its tracks. But they were dead wrong. From their grand vision of ruling Indochina, the Americans had no idea they were stepping into a deadly quagmire, a place where the world's greatest military power would be shattered by the unyielding will of a defiant people. From the very start, America pinned its hopes on No Dien Diem, their golden child, hand-picked to stand against the revolutionary tide from the north. But what they got wasn't a steadfast ally, it was a rotten, dictatorial regime. The No family ruled like kings, Diem as president, No Dinh Nhu pulling the strings, No Dinh Thuc lording over the Catholic Church, and No Dinh Can wielding power far and wide. Corruption ran rampant, with U.S. aid vanishing into private pockets while the people suffered in misery. The breaking point came in 1963, when Diem's regime unleashed brutal repression on Buddhists. Buddhist flags were torn apart, temples raided, and the world watched in horror as Venerable Thich Quang Duc set himself ablaze in the streets of Saigon. South Vietnam plunged into chaos, the people's rage boiling over. America realized their puppet was a liability. On November 1, 1963, with Washington's backing, a bloody coup erupted. Diem and his brother Nhu were gunned down, ending a dark chapter. But Diem's death didn't save the day. Saigon's government spiraled into turmoil, coup after coup, plot after plot. By 1967, Nguyen Van Thieu took the helm, promising stability. Reality? A weak, cowardly leadership clinging desperately to America's coattails. When the Liberation Army struck, these paper tigers showed their true colors. Thieu fled to Taiwan, No Quang Truong abandoned Hue, Lo Min Dao ditched Hsien Loc, and Nguyen Chau Kai hopped a helicopter to safety. On April 30, 1975, it all crumbled to dust. The darling child America had nurtured turned out to be an unsalvageable burden, a regime so rotten it dug its own grave long before the enemy could strike. They were the undisputed titans of warfare, America's military, armed with cutting-edge technology and a budget bigger than most nations' dreams. But in Vietnam, that Goliath met its David. Their first colossal blunder. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sprawling, 16,000-kilometer network of dirt paths and hidden sea routes, pumping lifeblood to the revolution. The U.S. threw everything at it, over 3 million tons of bombs, more than all of World War II combined, sheets of napalm that turned forests into infernos, and even a top-secret operation, Popeye, seeding clouds with silver iodide to unleash endless monsoons. From 1967 to 1972, 2,600 flights dumped 47,000 chemical units, costing $18 million, all to churn the trail into a muddy grave. And yet, the trucks never stopped. Day and night, hundreds of tons of weapons, food, and fighters flowed south, overland through Laos and Cambodia, and by sea on the legendary No-Number ships. Down in the south, the Liberation Army rewrote the rules of war. These weren't conventional soldiers marching in formation, they were guerrilla geniuses, wielding a tactic so cunning it turned America's might into a liability: grab the enemy by the belt and strike. They hugged U.S. positions so tightly, sometimes just meters away, that calling in airstrikes or artillery risked annihilating their own troops. Picture this: American GIs, armed with M16s and backed by helicopters, peering into the jungle, only to be ambushed by fighters who melted into the foliage. Bamboo traps snapped shut, punji stakes pierced boots, and sniper shots rang out from nowhere. To the terrified soldiers, these weren't men, they were talking bushes, a myth born from whispers in the leaves, a terror that stalked them through every patrol. One veteran later said, "It was like fighting ghosts, you'd hear them, feel them, but never see them until it was too late." Up north, the story was no less brutal. Hanoi faced the full wrath of America's air war. Operation Rolling Thunder alone dropped 864,000 tons of bombs from 1965 to 1968, aiming to break their spirit. But the North Vietnamese didn't just endure, they fought back. Their air defenses evolved into a lethal web. Soviets applied S-75 missiles, radar-guided cannons, and a fearless army of gunners. By 1972, they were downing the invincible. Over 15 B-52s fell in the infamous Linebacker 2 campaign, dubbed Dien Bien Phu in the sky. The U.S. lost 3,700 aircraft total, pilots captured or killed, and billions in hardware, all while Hanoi's factories hummed underground and its people rebuilt overnight. Their will was iron, no bomb could shatter it. The world's mightiest superpower, boasting tanks, jets, and an arsenal of doom, stood helpless before a mythic trail that refused to die and an enemy they couldn't outsmart. The talking bushes of the jungle and the unyielding soul of the North turned America's war into a quagmire of despair. Outwitted, outlasted, and out of answers, America's collapse was closing in. The war wasn't just fought in Vietnam's jungles, it raged in America's living rooms. By the mid-1960s, television broke free from government censorship, beaming the raw, unfiltered horror of the conflict straight to the public. Gone were the sanitized tales of heroism. Instead, 50 million Americans watched nightly newsreels of burning villages, crying orphans, and body bags piling up. From 40 war reporters in 1964, the number exploded to 600 by 1968, names like Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, leading the charge. His CBS broadcasts in '68, declaring the war unwinnable, hit like a bombshell. The truth was out, and it was ugly. That truth ignited a firestorm. What started as quiet unease morphed into a roaring anti-war movement. In 1965, Norman Morrison, a Quaker father, doused himself in gasoline and burned alive outside the Pentagon, a chilling protest that inspired Vietnamese poet to Hughes, "Emily, my child." By 1967, 50,000 marched on Washington. 2 years later, 500,000 flooded the Capitol, the largest anti-war rally in U.S. history. Students walked out, 4 million strong in 1970 after the Kent State shootings left 4 dead, gunned down by the National Guard. Draft dodgers fled to Canada or faced jail, including legend Muhammad Ali, who defied the call-up, saying, "No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word." The streets boiled with rage, America was tearing itself apart. Then came the knockout punch, the Pentagon Papers. In June 1971, 7,000 pages of classified files, leaked by whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, hit the press like a thunderclap. They exposed a web of lies spun by 4 presidents. Truman sabotaged the Geneva Accords, Eisenhower armed Diem's coup, Kennedy greenlit his ouster, and Johnson escalated the war while swearing peace to voters. The papers revealed secret bombings in Laos and Cambodia, naval raids on the north, all hidden from Congress and the public. The New York Times called it systematic deceit. Trust in the government shattered, the White House was now the enemy. But nothing shook America like the Tet Offensive of 1968. On January 31st, as families celebrated Lunar New Year, 80,000 liberation fighters launched a lightning strike, hitting Saigon, Hue, and 30 other towns in a single night. Commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy, battling Marines in a 6-hour firefight, their bodies sprawled on the lawn as choppers swooped in. The New York Times wrote, "This wasn't a weakening foe, it was proof of America's limits in Asia." For months, Johnson's generals had crowed about victory. Now, those boasts rang hollow. Tet didn't just wound the U.S. military, it crushed the nation's faith. From blind support to burning fury, the American people turned their backs on their own war. The fire of dissent didn't just flicker, it blazed, threatening to consume everything Washington had built. With every lie exposed and every battle lost, America's endgame was unraveling. December 1972, the skies above Hanoi burned. Operation Linebacker 2, dubbed Dien Bien Phu in the sky, was America's last desperate gamble. For 12 days and nights, 200 B-52 bombers, icons of U.S. might, unleashed 20,000 tons of explosives, aiming to bomb North Vietnam into submission. Nixon called it a maximum effort to force peace talks. But the North fought back with ferocity. 1,600 anti-aircraft guns and Soviet SAM missiles lit up the darkness, downing 15 of those invincible fortresses, 26 airmen dead, 33 captured. Hanoi's streets smoldered, yet its people stood defiant, rebuilding amid the rubble. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's advisor, later admitted, "We bombed them into accepting our concessions." The superpower blinked first. That crushing defeat forced America to the negotiating table. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending direct U.S. combat after a decade of blood. By March 29, the last 2,500 American troops boarded planes home, leaving behind a hollow promise to prop up Saigon. Nixon's Vietnamization plan, handing the war to South Vietnam's army, crumbled fast. Without U.S. air support, dollars, or boots on the ground, the Saigon regime was a house of cards in a storm. The Liberation Army smelled victory. Spring 1975, the endgame arrived. On April 30th, after a lightning campaign, liberation tanks smashed through the Independence Palace gates. General Duong Van Minh, Saigon's final president, surrendered unconditionally as the red and gold flag soared above the city. The South's army, once 1 million strong, dissolved in chaos, soldiers shed uniforms, officers fled, and a regime built on American dreams collapsed in hours. From Hanoi to the Mekong Delta, Vietnam was whole again. The war was over, and America's Grand Crusade lay in ruins. The cost was staggering, 58,220 American lives lost, etched on a black granite wall in Washington, plus 300,000 wounded and a nation scarred. Back home, the defeat wasn't just military, it was a wound to the soul. Trust in leaders evaporated, the credibility gap widened, and the U.S. recoiled from foreign wars for decades. Politicians wrestled with the Vietnam syndrome, a ghost that haunted policy and pride. America didn't just lose on the battlefield, they lost the faith of their people and a place in history's judgment. The bitter truth. America's downfall wasn't only in the jungles or skies, it was in the hearts they couldn't win and the legacy they couldn't rewrite. On April 30, 1975, a superpower fell, and a nation rose from its ashes.